Harvard Divinity School.
Theologies of Hope and Resistance, Palestine, South Africa, and Transnational Indigenous Communities, November 30th, 2021.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Hilary Rantisi, and I'm the Associate Director of the Religion, Conflict, and Peace Initiative, a program of religion and public life at Harvard Divinity School. Today's event, Theologies of Hope and Resistance, Palestine, South Africa, and Transnational Indigenous Communities, is part of the Religion, Conflict, and Peace Initiative webinar series and is the concluding event of this semester. The Religion, Conflict, and Peace Initiative centralizes an analysis of structural injustice, violence, and power, and examines how a more capacious understanding of religion can yield fresh insights into contemporary challenges and opportunities for just peace building. The primary case study we're focusing on is Israel-Palestine, and our aim is to stretch the scholarly discourse around religion and the practices of peace building, and to examine the decolonial potentialities of art, religion, and identity transformation. Our fall series is focused on the themes of religious terminologies in secular nationalism and political violence, and on decolonial sites of practice and theory in Israel-Palestine, as well as political emancipatory theologies from a comparative perspective, the focus of today's event. Thank you for joining us today. I'll now hand off to my colleague, Diane Moore, who will introduce herself and our panelists. Diane.
Thank you, Hilary, and welcome to everyone. I'm Diane Moore, and I'm the Director of Religion and Public Life at Harvard Divinity School. It is an incredible honor to be part of today's event, Theologies of Hope and Resistance, Palestine, South Africa, and Transnational Indigenous Communities, and to be in conversations with these three remarkable and distinguished guests. I'll briefly introduce each of them now, and then we'll just start our discussion shortly. Those brief introductions, encourage you to look these folks up because their bios would take up our entire hour if I were to give you the full overview. So Natalie Avalos is an assistant professor in the Ethnic Studies Department at the University of Colorado Boulder. She's an ethnographer of religion who received her PhD in religious studies from the University of California at Santa Barbara, with a special focus on Native American and indigenous religious traditions and Tibetan Buddhism. She's currently working on her manuscript titled The Metaphysics of Decoloniality, The Metaphysics of Decoloniality, Transnational Indigenities, and Religious Refusal. Sorry, I have to start that one again. It's such an important title in full, so I apologize for my tripping over it. The Metaphysics of Decoloniality, Transnational Indigeneities, and Religious Refusal, which explores urban, Indian, and Tibetan refugee religious life as decolonial praxis. She's a Chicana of Apache descent, born and raised in the Bay Area. Welcome, Natalie, wonderful to have you with us. Ebrahim Moosa is Mirza Family Professor of Islamic Thought and Muslim Societies in Notre Dame's Keough School of Global Affairs and the Department of History. He co-directs Contending Modernities along with our wonderful colleague Atalia Omer, the Global Research and Education Initiative examining the interaction among Catholic, Muslim, and other religious and secular forces in the world. His research spans both classical and modern Islamic thought, with a special focus on Islamic law, history, ethics, and theology. Born in South Africa, Professor Moosa earned his MA and PhD degrees from the University of Cape Town. And the Reverend Dr. Mitri Raheb is the founder and president of Dar al-Khalima University College of Arts and Culture in Bethlehem. Reverend Dr. Raheb is the author and editor of 40 books, including the soon-to-be-released Resisting Occupation, A Global Struggle for Liberation, which he co-edited with Miguel A. de la Torre. Reverend Dr. Raheb has also founded several NGOs, including the Christian Academic Forum for Citizenship in the Arab World, and is a founding and current board member of the National Library of Palestine and Kairos, Palestine. He holds a doctorate in theology from the Philipps University at Marburg, Germany. So first question, and again, welcome to all three of you. I'm so excited and honored to be part of this conversation to really look at these intersections of these various struggles and the powerful role that religion can play in these intersections. So Professor Moosa, tell us about your experience in the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa. What does it mean to speak of theology as hope, resistance, and a source of moral imagination?
Thank you so much, Professor Diane Moore, and my thanks to you and your colleagues, Hilary Rantisi, Ri Matasi, but more importantly, my colleague Natalie Avalos, who invited me to this event. And it's my great honor to be part of the program on religion and public life at Harvard. And I'm looking forward to my conversation with Professors Mitri Raheb and Natalie Avalos. So, I as a 17-year-old searching for faith and Islam in South Africa from a family that is of Indian descent. My great-grandfather came about 100 years ago to South Africa as a small trader. And I'm now looking for the biggest questions about, who am I? What is faith? What is my identity in South Africa? I ended up in India to go and study theology at the madrasas of India, the most orthodox institutions and so on. So in some ways, theology did shape my life, and I think shapes those of us who commit to a particular religious tradition, shapes our lives at multiple levels, as you phrased it. It is hope, it offers resistance and moral resistance. And I think, the shape of theology is often determined by history, tradition, context, but I also think by the contingencies. In 1980s, I was in South Africa. In 2021, I'm in America fighting a different kind of struggle for the struggle for justice in a world that has become much more unjust than the one that I have seen several decades ago. So what do I mean by history, tradition, context, and contingency? When I left South Africa at the age 17, I was in many ways a product of apartheid in multiple ways. I went to segregated schools. The socialization was about talking about white people, colored people, Black people in multiple ways and demeaning ways. And institutionalized racism does damage to the mind, the soul, and the body. It shapes your environment. And politics in my home was kind of muffled. I mean, I know my grandfather gave money to resistance movements and so on, but he also had to jump through all kinds of hoops to get through in life in South Africa by changing her identity from being an Indian to a colored in order to be able to trade in different places. So it forces you into unethical judgments and positions in a variety of ways. So, when I get to India, that's when I learned the gravity that apartheid was on the lives of Black people, especially in the aftermath of the 1976 Soweto uprisings, when the youth took the leadership and started saying that, racism, is damaging, and that was the issue about education, and that opened up the larger conversation. It's in India that I learned what my country is going through. In 79, the Islamic Revolution happens in Iran, and that's how my consciousness develops and so on. So political Islam makes me aware of Islam and the question of politics, but today I will call about Islam and the question of the ethical preoccupied my thinking. What was the Muslim response in South Africa in the 1980s when I get back after a sojourn in the United Kingdom as a journalist? The Muslim community is in a state of political quietism. In the 1970s, a very important, imam by name of Imam Abdullah Haroon, who was clandestinely politically active, sending, educating African young people, helping people to get into the resistance movement. He was killed in detention. And being killed in detention meant that, there was a pall over the Muslim community. He was only one of dozens of people killed in detention, as you know. An important theologian that I came to learn afterwards was part of the African National Congress, Maulana Kachalia. He went into exile. And before my return to South Africa in 1984, as a journalist in London, I wrote what many regard as the defining piece, in which I pointed out that it was decision time for Muslims in South Africa to take a position on the question of justice in South Africa. And what does Islam say as a theological tradition, as an ethical tradition, as a moral tradition on the question of racial injustice and minority rule? And when I get back and become an activist as a journalist during the day, activist at night, and so on, one of the most difficult issues and the difficult stage of my life was to persuade and convince fellow Muslim religious leaders who had become accustomed to the status quo and its incentives. It became difficult and challenging to make them support liberation, but also make them aware of the risks this involves. And many were not prepared to take the risks. It becomes divisive amongst groups and families. People have different kinds of strategies. There were people who were talking about incrementalist changes that work with the white minority for incremental change. And obviously we know that all this incremental change only led to more Bantustans, more divisions, and injustice for the majority. So critical to my work, and I know I have limited amount of time here, critical to my work was the importance of thinking. How do we think in a theological register that is both creative, imaginative, and also is humane? I mean, one of the great challenges that I think for any kind of theological thinking is that we are so strong on the need for justice that oftentimes you can lose your humanity in your search for justice. And that's the guardrails that any kind of, liberation movement and theological movement should have. I always remember our frustration with Desmond Tutu, the great Archbishop Desmond Tutu, our frustration with him that he would go and talk to Botha, and he would come out and he said, I met the Prime Minister or the President, and in his own way, Desmond Tutu would say, and we prayed first. And we would really get, as a young person, I would get angry. It's only in the aftermath that I realized that Tutu was 100% right. You have to humanize the other. Because if you do not humanize the other, you dehumanize yourself. And so, this question of thinking that you ask about and imagination, today I can articulate with the help of Hannah Arendt that the reality we see in front of us, what I saw in the 1980s, 1970s, growing up in South Africa in the 1980s, the reality in front of us is the reality in which we have to shape our future. And at the same time, we're also imagining a future, what Arendt calls a thought object. We imagine that future, what emancipation and liberation will bring. And the combination of our reality in front of us and that object we imagine, which becomes our imagination, makes, as Arendt says, makes us go further, gives us the courage to go further, to take the next step, and so on. And thinking with imagination does make us go further. It gives us courage and gives us the minimal or maximal assurance of the rightness of our cause. And, I'm reminded here of the Spanish poet and playwright Federico Garcia Lorca, who wrote beautifully about the imagination. But he said imagination is limited by reality. And therefore, imagination is synonymous with the aptitude for discovery. And so I think thinking and action, so I don't take action to be separate from thinking. Thinking is part of a process of acting, an embodied form of doing work. And I think it is this ability to take this, to go further, as Arendt says. It's this faith in a transcendent power that reinforces us, psychologically. And here the teachings of the Quran, that God's grace is with the oppressed and the obligation to resist injustice, became the clarion call for me and my colleagues. And those of us who then, started writing and practicing and organizing a variety of Muslim groups to resist apartheid, the Muslim Youth Movement, the Muslim Students Association, the Call of Islam, Qibla, and a whole range of groups, different kinds of ideological perspectives. Also the inspiration from the life of the Prophet Muhammad in his resistance to expulsion from his homeland and so on. So I think it was, when I compare my life as a person of color, racially identified as Indian, it was nothing compared to the lives of people of African heritage that was really, really reduced to, bare existence, and equipped with theology and Islamic teachings, compelled me and others to act on behalf of the dispossessed and the poor, and to fight and sacrifice if need be on behalf of the voiceless. And there's some privilege of knowing and learning, and the ability and that oblige me to fulfill my responsibility. So I will pause right there, and we can talk further. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you so much. Incredible biography that you experienced with the power of religion, both in its destructive as well as its constructive forces, and your own experiences are just woven so powerfully throughout that narrative. So thank you so much for that foundation. I'm going to turn to you now, Professor Raheb. What is the relation between theology and resistance in Palestine? And if you could also address the challenges, the current explicit challenges of Christian Zionism relevant to the context today. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Diane, and good to see you again and to be with you this evening. Theology really is trying to logically explain the scripture in a way that it turns to be good news. For us, it has to be good news. Yet, unfortunately, if you are Palestinians, often theology comes to you across as being bad news. It's basically God, taking your native land and giving it to another people. You hear about the chosen people, and then you are what? The cursed, or the unchosen, or the left behind, and so in our case as Palestinians, the Bible becomes, unfortunately, bad news. And this is the struggle often we feel we are in the midst of that, especially when we deal with Christian Zionists, where basically our misery is explained as being the goodwill of God. And that does not make sense for us. These, Christian Zionists are not the crazy, right-wing Christian fundamentalists that we think of, because there are many Christian Zionists who are actually very liberal in their outlook. And so I came to define actually Christian Zionism as a Christian lobby in support of settler colonialism of Palestine by adopting a biblical theological meta-narrative while taking local consideration into account. It's a bit complicated, but these are basically the different aspects of Christian Zionism. So for me, it's basically first a Christian lobby. So I'm not only interested in what these people believe, but what their action is based on that belief. So basically action-oriented. because I can be very, very tolerant when it comes to ideas and what people believe. But when that beliefs somehow do harm to me, this is when it becomes, the red flag goes up. And secondly, it is connected to a meta-narrative. And this is really the danger of this kind of thinking, because, Christian Zionists do not think that what they are doing is political advocacy. If it were that, I can tolerate that. I have no problem with that. But they think, that is what they are doing is part of a divine plan that is much larger. And they are just actually helping implementing the divine plan, the problem on our cost. That's where it becomes very serious. And the third element are local consideration, because often actually, Christian Zionists are really not interested neither in the Palestinians nor in the Jewish Israeli. They are interested in their issue of abortion. This is what they are fighting for. Against abortion. And somehow they connect this within that meta-narrative with Israel. And then the issue of Israel-Palestine become a global issue that they are fighting for. And so, when you feel this, when you experience this, often, unfortunately, by your fellow Christians, these are fellow Christians who do that and think that. And they believe that as Palestinian Christians, we are like not kosher Christian. And so this hurts. And actually this creates this will of resistance to resist this kinds of theology, but also to resist the settler colonialism that they support. Because on the other hand, also the settler colonialists, they have a framework, a theoretical framework, maybe they are aware of or not, but they come to settle in a land, not for a while, but permanently. This is the different from neocolonialism like. And ultimately, they want to replace the native people. And thus the native people, in this case, the Palestinians, they become the aliens at home. Our land become the empty land, the land without a people for a people without a land. And we become the savage or the violent terrorists, while the settler become the brave pioneers. And to defend this settler colonialism property that they take from the savage, they create a police state. And that police state is given extraordinary power over us native people. And in all cases, almost the Bible is used to sugarcoat these practices. So colonization becomes civilization. Colonization becomes Christianization. Colonization becomes Judaization. And so, and this is, I think, here it's important that to connect the dots, because this is not an exclusive Palestinian experience. This is the experience of Blacks in South Africa, but this is the experience of Native and First Nation in North America, and this is the experience of Aboriginals in Australia. And once you start connecting the dot, actually you are facing like a global power that we need to resist. And so how to resist? And this is maybe the last thing I want to say before I'm sure you want to move on. I often say that sometimes we feel we are occupied not only by military power, which I call the hardware. The software, the theology, is as dangerous as the hardware. because it gives the military power that sugar coat, that soft feeling, that actually what these people are doing is something actually divine. And so our role here, I think, as theologian, is to crack this software. So often when people ask me, what is your profession? I say software cracking, because this is what we need really to do. And secondly, we need to network with all of these people that I mentioned, that they face similar experience like us. And this is why I'm glad to be here connected with, theologians and thinkers from with South African background and Native American. This is so important for me. And the third and last point is we need, when we resist, to develop our own narrative. That is so important. So we cannot just react. That's not enough. We need to act proactively. And so, often as theologians in Palestine, we used to live from the crumbs that comes down from the tables of German theologians or British theologians or whatever. My mother used to say she likes to drink lemonade only from the water of our own well. And I think as theologians, as native theologians, we need to develop the skill to make lemonade with water that is taken from our own well.
Oh, powerful. Thank you so much, Mitri. Just, again, the representation of the combination of the power of religion across contexts to both support terrible acts of violence, structural forms of violence, direct forms of violence, as well as potential inspiration to thwart those forms of violence, is just, again, very clearly articulated in your context and in your insightful comments. So thank you so much. Professor Avalos, you have been participating in relatively recent conversations on the need and meaning of decolonizing the study of religion itself, which is such a critical dimension of this understanding the power of religion, and then and in part, again, deconstructing it. What in your own words does that mean? How does decolonizing religion relate to your conceptualization of comparative indigenous resistance? And what is the relation between indigenous resistance as well as indigenous traditions and emancipatory approaches to theology? And again, here perhaps you can speak on the coloniality of theology itself. And again, just so excited to hear your thoughts on these critical intersections.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate this invitation, and I am really inspired by the brilliant words of our first two speakers. And so, when I think about decolonization, I think about challenging and essentially trying to deconstruct the legacy of colonialism. And I like the metaphor of the hardware and the software, right? That decolonization is both interrogating the kind of material reality of the political, economic, material outcomes of colonialism, but also the ideological, right? And that those structural legacies, that they both structure our world, and that those structural legacies essentially create ideologies, or I'm sorry, they create hierarchies. So you have a hierarchy of peoples, you have a hierarchy of religious worlds and beliefs, and then you have a hierarchy of material wealth and outcomes that map onto those peoples and their beliefs. And so we have to understand, one of the things that's so productive about decolonial theory for me, and also putting it in conversation with the kind of work on decolonization coming from indigenous studies, is to see how knowledge production is deeply tethered to imperial projects, right? And so if we think about religious studies as a place that has essentially been built on primitivism. It's been built on Orientalism, and that these are not necessarily specific to religious studies. This is specific to knowledge production in the modern period, right? And so we can think about modernity itself as really, this is what decolonial scholars tell us, that modernity itself is coloniality, that it's completely, it's the water that we swim in, right? It's a totalizing worldview, a kind of a hegemonic worldview. And so when we think in terms of, you know, even the coloniality of theology, or even thinking about the ways in which coloniality is operating there, you know, one of the issues that comes up in religious studies is not only the way in which indigenous epistemologies have been pathologized or even undermined is not even legitimate religions or even religious or even legitimate worlds, right? Or ways of knowing, but also the ways in which that kind of thinking justified and continued to structurally operate. It became enshrined in law and dispossessed Native peoples, right? So there's a direct correlation between characterizing Native peoples or First Peoples knowledges as animistic, childish, superstitious, primitive, and then arguing that they no longer have the rationality, or they must not have the rationality to govern themselves or to lay legitimate claims to their lands, right? So I think those are two really important parts, right? Thinking about knowledge production in this way, but also thinking that it's not just religious studies. I think we're trying to unpack that in academic institutions really globally at this point. Another thing that I think is really important in terms of decolonizing religious studies is trying to understand how that structural racism continues to operate. We may think, and I've given talks and I've been told, well, there's no way that we could have these 19th century perceptions of racism and Orientalism still operating in the way that we think and work, while simultaneously being told, well, of course, indigenous civilizations are dead and gone. Of course, they're over. Of course, they're incapable of recovering, right? So again, these deeply primitivist ideas that are existing within people, right? And they're also operating in ways where we perceive indigenous scholars or sometimes non-Christian or non-Western scholars as being incapable or unable to really operate at the same level of coherence, at the same capability. And so just given the kinds of structural racism I experienced personally, even as someone that's light-skinned, but talks about power, interrogates power, you know, you get big reactions from people. And I think it's also important to understand, again, I really appreciate this hardware and software metaphors here, that this is operating on a body level, that these systems of power are operating on a body level, and they're impacting us psychologically, emotionally. And I think we're so collectively enshrined in these dynamics that we sometimes shut down in these conversations, right? That we feel so deeply complicit or powerless. And something that I'm trying to do by talking about indigenous epistemologies and even doing comparative work is, if we can visibilize power, if we can visibilize how these kinds of colonial logics, grammars of racialization, right, especially in settler colonial context, how is it that religion is being pathologized in a context of Tibet, right? How is the People's Republic of China pathologizing Tibet? And so to me, why might I use this comparative framework? Well, it's to visibilize power. It's to help us understand that, you know, that again, these are global, as others have said, these are global logics that are operating, they're borrowed, right? It's not just operating in the US, it's not just operating in the Americas, it's operating around the world. And that if we can see that, we don't necessarily have to take any sort of personal blame or responsibility. Instead, just understand the nature of the problem and then unpack it collectively, right? And I think it's really important for us to think about how, centering Indigenous religious life as a kind of epistemological reclamation also helps us understand that religious praxis is also healing praxis. That's why you think of it as decolonial praxis. I'll say more about this when we talk in our next question. I'll leave it there. But yeah, that's what I'll say for now. Thank you.
Oh, beautifully articulated, all three of you. I mean, I think the heart of what we're talking about, and again, I also want to thank you, Mitri, for the software, hardware language, because I think ultimately it's what are the stories that give legitimacy to practices of power in any given context, and that set of questions is really a critical one. And then they play out in very particular context. So context matters, but the narratives of what are the stories that give legitimacy to structural forms of racism, structural forms of abuse, as well as potentially, okay, what stories need to be lifted up to give challenge to those structural forces of violence. And so this is, again, just a wonderful foundation for the next set of questions, which again will be offered to all three of you, and would love for you not only to respond individually, but perhaps respond to each other as well. And this, again, we recognize that this question is to all of you, and that you'll all be coming at this question from your particular situatedness, your particular perspectives. So as we know, religion is implicated, as you all have articulated so beautifully, in structures of local and global violence and repressive and dehumanizing ideological formations in ways that directly affect your areas of special scholarship, as well as your autobiographical embeddedness, your experiences, your situated experiences as people in these contexts. But as we also know, religion can be a powerful force for positive social change, or what we're calling religion. And again, I want to just honor the concern about even religion itself, that language. And that's, again, your important work, Natalie, is to just realize that religion itself is implicated in this, but and recognize that we have to come at that with a critical lens. But how in each of your contexts has religious and spiritual praxis, praxis, shaped political and social mobilization, co-resistance, critique, and imaginations of different futures? So I'll just open that up and invite all of you to respond as you are inspired to do.
If I may jump in.
Great, thank you.
So oftentimes, at least modern religion, the way in which secularism has given religion a certain place, right, made it private, limited its role in public spheres. That might only be the ideal in some places, but not the reality in different spaces around the world. So I think, but in terms of the history of religions, I think the way you framed it and so on, of how religion had provided on the local and global level violence and repression, dehumanizing features, I think these are things we cannot argue with. And I think what we need to think about is, how does one ameliorate that? And how does one, find those moments within the religious traditions that is the opposite to that, and that the religion doesn't become implicated in future acts of violence and repression. The one thing I would say is that, in many ways, religion is not what we call religion, is not separate from interests and power. Right. And because human beings are always implicated in power, and everything involves power. Even when you are engaging in an emancipatory act, there's a certain kind of power. obviously that power will be more humane. It will have more self-reflexivity, a better way of thinking about it, and not to cause the harm and the damage that brute power does. The other point is that, many of the religious traditions, not all, but, Christianity, Islam, even Judaism, Hinduism, and others, these religious traditions come from a background of empire. They were imperial orders, and theologies were formed within those imperial orders. That is the shaping and the making of those theologies and religious practices and so on. And these have to be revisited. It's in situations like South Africa, Israel, Palestine, the plight and the conditions of indigenous communities around the world, in North America, in Australia, in different parts of Africa and so on, that we have to revisit those inherited theologies and say, how have they contributed to, oppression and injustice, environmental degradation, and so on, that we need to revisit those. And I think in the moments where, these religious traditions get involved in a praxis, as you put it, of justice and so on, some of those negative aspects become apparent to practitioners. Example is, as I'm working in South Africa, doing the work in, conscientizing the community and so on, some of the participants asked me to lead a Quran exegesis class, and how to interpret the Quran and do some reflection there. And very soon, when we're thinking about the foremost question is a question of political justice and so on, that was obviously the goal, to see how the teachings of faith could reinforce us. You quickly realize that some of the teachings that we have accepted does not really enhance gender justice, doesn't really enhance, environmental justice. Suddenly you realize a whole spate of questions that open up that you need to revisit. And so I think that, as I think Natalie and others have pointed out, that what we call knowledge of the tradition is already shaped with those negative instantiations of power. And therefore, decolonizing the religious traditions themselves and their modes of thinking is also an imperative. And it comes very, very powerfully in instances of praxis where theory meets, where the rubber hits the road, where theory meets the practice, and now you have to rethink. And so I don't think religion needs to do politics and economics. I think the way we understand what we call theology, it can hold out a moral and ethical mirror to a variety of things, but the mirror should not be one that you're absorbing what dominant society is imaging on us, but rather what the best moments of our religious traditions have offered, that moves away from domination to that of coexistence and meaningful realization of life.
Thank you. Thank you.
I want to give Mitri a chance to respond first, because you were the second speaker, so please do. No, okay. So I just didn't want to jump ahead, but thank you. So, that it's really, I think that thinking about the legacies of religious traditions, kind of these more global religious traditions, is deeply embedded and entwined with the empire. The work that I do, it's really helpful to think in those terms, because the questions that I had in my own research was, how is it that Native people in contemporary US life, thinking that 70% of Native people in the US are urban and they have a land-based religious tradition. So how might they continue to thrive and really survive and navigate that survival, that kind of not just epistemological, but a kind of metaphysical survival? And how might they do that in response to settler colonial power? And then I began to think about the parallels with Tibet. And so how then do people metaphysically survive? Because survival is not just about having your basic human needs. It's about holding on to your world and your realities, and we sometimes think of theologies as a system of beliefs, but again, it's an entire metaphysical world. And when we're thinking in terms of empire and these kinds of power asymmetries that empire perpetuates, we're also seeing the ways in which entire worlds are attacked, deconstructed, pathologized, and disfigured in the process of colonialism, right? So my question was, how do you, in that context, survive? How do you continue to thrive in that context? And what I found as I was talking to people is that really just the reclamation of these worlds is a form of resistance, but it's really a kind of refusal. It's a refusal of cultural genocide. It's a refusal to assimilate, to acquiesce, to give up their realities. And it's, in some ways, it's also saying, my reality is legitimate. One of the tensions and one of the interesting parallels that exist for Native people and Tibetan peoples is that they're often both exoticized as being very mystical. They're both land-based traditions, but that again is deeply tethered to primitivism. The sense that, oh, well, these people, they're kind of like noble savages, right? Like they're so mystical and full of this wisdom, the spiritual wisdom, but this characterization also means that they are innately, quote unquote, irrational. And of course, these kinds of irrational people, as I said before, they can't govern themselves. They can't be legitimately interested in sovereignty and self-governing, because we think in terms, we've been socialized to think that governments and sovereignty are really tethered to a particular kind of power, relationships to power, right? And that the kind of, expanding empire that took place and was fomenting in the Americas of Christendom, it kind of set the stage for contemporary racialization, the contemporary logics of othering. But then even during the modern period, the way in which nation states began to develop and think in this, more democratic, but still hierarchical terms, I think it's deeply steeped in a materialism that these two traditions can never really, they'll never be able to absorb. These traditions are land-based, and what I mean by land-based is that they're driven by relationships to the immaterial world. And so your sense of personhood is always contingent. It's coextensive with others, but not just human others, with other than human persons, right? With mountains, with rivers, with springs. And so that in itself, for Indigenous peoples, often is their argument for what sovereignty looks like. Well, sovereignty looks like having these and reclaiming these relationships, because it's not just peoples that are sovereign, lands themselves are sovereign. They themselves have multiple personalities. They have their own agency. And so I think, when we're talking about imagining new worlds, part of this religious refusal that I'm seeing with these two communities is they're essentially refusing to live in a materialist, oversimplified world. They're saying, well, we're going to live in this broader way and reclaim our ontological health and well-being. And that in itself is deeply restorative. And that's what I'll say for now.
I think I can jump in here, and I agree with my colleagues very much so. But I would like maybe to start with a comment, Diane, because, as a pastor, I have many hats, right? And then sometimes as a pastor, secular people look at me and say, only if we can get rid of religion, there will be less violence in the world. And usually what I say is actually the mess that religion is right now in has to do with the mess that was created by nationalism in the first half of the 20th century and in the 19th century colonialism. If we didn't have that history of colonialism, and if we didn't have that failed notion of nationalism, I think religion today will be much better off. And so this is just, you know, to make sure that we understand that, you know, actually politics as well as religion have, you know, that potential to be violent.
Absolutely.
For me, I like to see religion always in context. At the end, I'm a contextual theologian. And so there is no religion for me, Christianity or Islam, just like this. And so when I think why now this religious potential in religion, why now? And for me, the year 1967 is the important context I have to look at. Because the war of 1967, when Israel came out victoriously against several Arab countries, this created two things. First of all, it created Jewish messianism. You had, you know, these Jewish settlers who thought, oh, now we can settle in Hebron and in Samaria, around Nablus and so on. That's the land of our ancestor. It gave Christian Zionists a huge push because they saw God fighting on the side of Israel. I mean, literally, they saw angels, you know, in that fight. On the other hand, so these Jewish messianists and the Christian Zionists were drunk in power. And here where power comes in, I think both Ebrahim and Natalie alluded to that. For the Muslim world, the defeat was very humiliating. And saying 5 times a day, God is great, and yet, you know, experiencing this humiliating defeat was not easy to absorb. And so Islam has somehow to prove that, no, they are powerful. And so all of that, I think, created all of this mess we are in right now. And especially, I think, in all 3 cases, we see a blend of religion and nationalism. And this is the worst thing that can happen. If you blend, you know, national ideology with religious ideology. To make it a bit maybe clearer, 2009, at our university, we started the research project on religion and state in the Middle East. And when I went into this whole research, the idea was, you know, only if we understand what Islam is saying about religion and state and what Christianity is saying about religion and state, maybe we can find these, you know, light spots that we can relate to. By the end of this research, we found out actually it has nothing to do with the texts. What we face today in the Middle East is that those who are in power, you know, they use religion to stay in power. And those who are in the position, they use religion to get to power. So again, really, it has less to do with the text. It has to do with changing the power relations. And this brings me actually to my actual point that I wanted to say, because I guess if what brought me to think about contextual theology and to develop contextual theology was after coming back from Germany, after finishing my doctorate, I came back, you know, I thought I'm coming back with all the answers, religious answers to what people will be asking me, especially, you know, having studied in Germany at that time, I thought, yeah, you know, this is the cream of the cream, yeah. just to discover that the people in Palestine had totally different questions. So the answers I brought with me really do not correspond to where people are. And so I had to listen carefully to what people are saying, in this case, the oppressed people. And so I think if religion wants to play a positive role, we need to listen to those oppressed, meaning, are these texts, religious texts, irrespective if they are Christian, Jewish, Muslim, whatever, are these texts of liberation or colonization? That's the question we have always to ask ourselves. And so can we be agents of colonization, or are we agents of liberation? And then what kind of liberation can we provide? Having said that, maybe just to conclude, so for me, this listening to our own people was inspiring to reread the text. But I ended up at the end of the day establishing a university for the arts, because I thought in our context right now, arts might be the tool for social transformation. So the inspiration for me came from theology, but the tools, they should not be theological in my case, but really artistic, because we need, especially if we talk about imagination, I think art is very important to open that whole realm of imagination for people, to set free that creativity and to unleash the power that our young people have.
Oh, thank you. Thank you all. We just literally have another minute and a half. If I could just try to synthesize the rich conversation we just had. I want to return at least one arena of synthesis would be back to this question of praxis. Praxis by definition requires context, and praxis, utilizing the normative way that we think about that, is about action, reflection, and action. So it's essentially utilizing the tools of critical reflection about the context we're in, realizing we are impacted by that context, but wanting to imagine something else. And that requires a dialogical experience of consciousness, ongoing underlying consciousness. And just to pick up on your critical points, Natalie, about again, this notion of the decolonization itself of religion, is to be able to say that, back to what you also identified, Ebrahim, is to say that these religions, the major religions, are empire religions. But always within each of these traditions, there has always been counter forces that didn't win out hegemonically, but we're always challenging both notions of hierarchy and notions of individuality, which again, Natalie, your comment about the indigenous communities and the intersectionality, the interdependence, not just about the autonomous individual, which is deeply a modern product and one that is given to be inevitable, is absolutely not at all inevitable. And so to have a vision of possibility outside of the realities we live in, to keep that vision before us and to engage in praxis to help undo the terrible structures of violence that, again, permeate our cultures, but to realize that utilizing imagination, utilizing the arts, utilizing theological reflections on the foundations themselves that can create new horizons. I think you all three have given us such rich ways to be thinking in fresh ways about these immense challenges we face. So thank you deeply for all of us here in the room, and for the incredible and important work that you do. It is, again, our phenomenal privilege to host this conversation. Time is too short. There's so much more to be said, but thank you for this foundation. And thank all of you who are here in the room participating. We're so grateful for your presence. And again, this recording will be available for further reflection, and hope that you all will utilize it in that way to continue this conversation. Thank you all deeply.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. Good to see you all.
Sponsor, Religion, Conflict, and Peace Initiative.
Copyright 2021, the President and Fellows of Harvard College.